So good afternoon. I have the great pleasure of introducing the panel on the Colorado River and the future of water in the West, or perhaps I should say the future of the West, because water is such a big factor on where we are going. As you may know, the Colorado River is governed by the law of the river. The mic? Yes. Sorry. I could see people moving, and I wasn't sure what was going on. So the Colorado River is governed by the law of the river, and there was this little leaflet outside that will give you an introduction of what that is. One of the key points is the 1922 Interstate Water Compact. And as you can imagine, 100 years ago, they couldn't predict how much demand will increase, both because the West has grown so much. Phoenix was not even a really important city back then, or because we consume more water as it gets hotter. But it also could not predict, right, like the decreased supplies that we are facing as we face this mega drought. Not only they could not predict what will happen, but we know now that it's not flexible enough to move us to the future. And what this panel is going to do is tell us where we are and where we may go in the near future regarding the Colorado River. And this is something that affects 40 million people, 7 states, 2 countries. So it really affects us all. Discussing this in 90 minutes is an Herculean task, but if a panel can do it, it's the panel I have here. So I'm gonna briefly introduce all of them and then give the floor to Andrea. So first we have Andrea Gerlach. He's the director of the University of Arizona Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and a professor in the Department of Geography, Development, and Environment. Then we have Sarah Porter, who is the inaugural director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy, and she before had managed the Western River program at the Audubon Society. And finally, we have J.B. Hamby, who is the Commissioner for California in the Colorado River Board, the chairman of the Colorado River Board of California, and had served in the board of directors of the Imperial Irrigation District, one of the big players in the Colorado discussion. So with that, Andrea, the floor is yours.
It's really good to be here, and after lunch is always a tough spot because we all want to go and take a nap, but hope you had a little coffee and you're ready to get going. I'm a faculty member at the University of Arizona, and I've been studying water, thinking about it, teaching about it for the last couple of decades now, and I have the privilege for the last number of years to help direct the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, and it's named after the Udall family, but especially Morris and Stuart Udall, who had a great impact nationally, but certainly in our state when it comes to issues around water and when it comes to issues around tribal nations. I'm really here, I'm going first because I'm really going to kick us off and lay a lot of foundation that my 2 colleagues will build from. Okay, we're off to a great start.
Oh, no.
It's okay.
Okay, wow, it just did not want to show
We want to advance.
Okay, you know
There
what?
we go.
We're not going to do full screen.
Okay, here we are. Okay, perfect, thanks. Well, the Colorado River has been in the news. You can hardly kind of escape almost a story. In fact, I kind of joke with my partner that if we just happen to be on vacation when something breaks, I come back and have to like catch up with 15 news, like a pretty big news cycle that we miss. So these are just capturing some of the headlines around the Colorado River in recent years, in recent months, in recent days, excuse me. What really often makes the headlines are these lakes, and they're the 2 major reservoirs on the river, and really what gets reported in the news is these low lake levels, these bathtub rings around both Lake Mead and Lake Powell. We know that both reservoirs are only about 1/3 full today, and that's what kind of puts people in a little bit of a panic. We know that rivers are at the heart of every major civilization, whether it's Egypt and the Nile, or China and the Yellow River, and the Ganges and India, and the Colorado is really no exception. It's really thought to be the lifeblood of the American Southwest and of northwestern Mexico. The river runs 1,400 miles, begins in the Rocky Mountains, tries to make its way to the Gulf of California, goes through 7 US states, 2 states in Mexico, 30 federally recognized tribes, 11 national parks and monuments, including the Grand Canyon. It forms the international border for 27 kilometers with the US and Mexico. And as Vanessa said, 40 million people, 5 million acres of farmland, and an important source of hydropower. We're here in Phoenix at the bottom of the basin, you can see on the map. I like this map because the dark black lines really shows the boundaries of the basin. It also shows you the division between the upper and the lower. So in the upper, you have Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. And then the lower, you have Arizona, Nevada, California. And then you can see how the river is trying to make its way to the sea. What this map also shows you are those kind of red, the areas with the little red slash lines shows you how we move water outside of the basin. And we do that to Denver and Los Angeles and other places. So water goes out of the basin as well. And a third map, because I teach in a geography department and we get that privilege to show lots of maps. I probably could have showed you 10 different maps. I had to make some decisions here. What I like about this map is it shows you that there are a lot of tributaries that flow into the Colorado, the Gila, the Green, the Yampa, and it's important to see that. This is the outline for today. 3 big things we're going to go through: a little bit of history and context of the river, some human and environmental challenges that we face, and then modern governance. So history and context. Well, people were cultivating crops in the West way before the Spanish and Anglo-American settlers arrived. And I was really thrilled to see such wonderful tribal representation here today. It doesn't always happen at every session on water or the West. It was really great to see that. Native peoples used canals for irrigation on the Santa Cruz River in Tucson as early as 1200 BC, and canal irrigation was established in Phoenix along the Gila and Salt Rivers by about 500 AD. And we know there are more than 500 canals dug by hand with simple stone tools. We saw a little bit of in the land acknowledgement at the beginning of our day today, and Joseph with the Gila River Indian community also talked a little bit about this. And indigenous peoples in this area grew cotton and squash and tobacco and beans and maize, and the settlers, the Anglo settlers, really built their hydrologic infrastructure on what was the Native Nations canals and irrigation structure. Today, there are 30 tribes in the basin. They've lived here for more than 10,000 years, and they find many values and uses for water, everything from cultural and spiritual to agriculture, as we heard, to municipal, to power generation, recreation, etc. Well, fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, and we started building dams. This was part of the big reclamation era when the federal government got involved with reclaiming water in the West. We get Hoover Dam in 1935, Glen Canyon Dam a little bit later in 1966, and it's really a change. This marks a change in focus of rural irrigation to moving water for urban areas, moving water for cities. So with these dams, we created this complex system of reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell being the 2 major ones. And then, of course, the hydro provides an important source of hydropower. I always like this. It's kind of cartoonish, but what it's trying to show you with these different buckets are the kind of the big reservoirs, the places where we hold a lot of water, and then the smaller ones. We often focus on Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam as the 2 biggest, but there are actually 15 dams on the main stem and hundreds of dams on the tributaries. The river is governed by a series of negotiations, litigations, and legislations, and all together we call that the law of the river. So the law of the river isn't one thing, it's all these things added up. And so you need to think about the law, the governance that we have as a series of agreements. At the heart of the law of the river is the Colorado River Compact and the treaty with Mexico. Some people say that the Colorado River is the most litigated and legislated river in the world. So this shows a map on the right-hand side and then some allocations on the left. And when the gentlemen who were representing the 7 basin states got together in New Mexico in 1922 to allocate the waters of the Colorado River, these are the decisions they made. They decided to give 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin and 7.5 acre feet to the lower basin. We know now that they made these calculations on some kind of faulty hydrology. The few years prior to 1922 were pretty wet years, and so the data they had kind of indicated that there was more water than there really was in the river. This is just, again, because I love maps, another map, and it just shows you that apportionment a little bit differently. It shows you that the upper basin distributes their 7.5 million acre feet on a percentage basis, but the lower basin actually set amounts and they divided. And you can see how California got the most, Nevada got the least, and Arizona somewhere in between. The Central Arizona Project, someone on an earlier panel mentioned this, the CAP, the CAP project. This is considered to be the last major water project in the basin. It's also thought to be one of the most expensive aqueduct projects ever constructed in the US. It started in 1973, it got finished in 1993. It brings water, Colorado River water, to Arizona, to Pima County, which is where Tucson is, Maricopa County, where we are, and Pinal County, which is in between Tucson and Phoenix. 336 miles, moves water uphill. We lose a lot from evaporation. This is the water that a lot of people in Arizona are concerned about. We're concerned that if Lake Mead levels fall, that we could really lose some reduction in our supply here. Arizona is junior. As part of the deal to get this CAP project, Arizona had to agree to have junior rights. That's why when you hear that there's shortage in the basin and cuts have to be taken, Arizona goes first. Folks have talked a little bit about tribal water rights. People spend their entire careers on this, and I'm not someone who does, but what I want to do is paint a little bit of a picture here for you. Tribes were left out of that 1922 compact. We've had, since the 1960s, there's been a settlement process to resolve that, to mitigate that. Tribes have recognized rights to about 3.2 million acre feet, or about 25% of the river's supply. So some tribes have some of the most senior rights in the basin. I crafted 3 circles here, and the one on the far left is the main stem reservations. These were tribes that negotiated and settled back in the 1960s, some with the Arizona v. California lawsuit. In the middle are the Central Arizona tribes, and many of these settlements came about as part of the construction of the Central Arizona Project. And on the far right, I might have the directions wrong, forgive me. On the far right, you can see the Upper Basin tribes, and this is where there are tribes that have some settlements, but some partial resolved claims and some unresolved claims. Okay, a quick look at today's challenges. They're human challenges and they're environmental challenges. Well, you can imagine the dams provide these great reservoirs and bring water to different communities in the basin, but they've also had some ecological consequences. We know dams block sediment. We know all of the irrigation and agriculture leads to high salinity, and we know that we've really harmed the delta that's at the very bottom of the basin. We know rivers are trying to make their way to the sea, and all of the uses are like straws off the river, and by the time the river makes its way, there isn't much of the river that's really left. We also know, because of climate change and other environmental conditions, a lot of the native species are at threat, and new invasive species have moved in terms of fish, but also plants. We know there's a changing climate. We're 23 years, maybe 24 years into a drought now. They're calling it a mega drought. The Colorado River gets its water from melting snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, so we have to wait and see what the winter season looked like. And then in April, we wait for an important date in April when Bureau of Reclamation tells us what they know, and we can see how much water will melt and come down through the river. We've had below average runoff, and this graph just shows you that. You could see Lake Mead in blue and Lake Powell in gray, and you could see when they were at their height of their storage, and then you can see the decline pretty much from 2000 going forward. So how people talk about it today is that we're in a structural deficit. Structural deficit. So it basically means that we have given away more water than there is in the system. So you could imagine what that means with your household finances if you have more expenses than you have income. It's really a simple analogy. So to walk you through it, we gave 7.5 million acre feet to the upper, 7.5 to the lower basin. That was in 1922 with the compact. In 1944, the US said, oops, we forgot about Mexico, so they signed a treaty with Mexico to give Mexico 1.5 million acre feet. That takes us to 6.5 million acre feet, but we know now the flow is about 13. So we've given away, we've given legal water rights, given away more than there is in the river. And the climate projections suggest that the river is going to reduce even more, 10 to 30% by 2050. So that $13 million acre feet number is going to decline. So it's structural because it's built into the structure of how we govern and manage the basin. There are these unresolved tribal claims. I just mentioned them briefly, but not all. There's been a pretty rich discussion about this already. Not all of the tribal claims have been resolved. 11 of them still remain. There are negotiations that the U.S. Department of Interior is leading in its trust responsibility with tribes. All of the settlements have to be ratified by Congress, so there's that role as well. And so this is a big unknown. If the tribes get their full allocation that they've been asking for, that they're legally entitled to, that dates back to the date of the reservation, it puts more pressure on an otherwise stressed system. I've been doing research for the past couple of years around some of these programs that we've established in the Colorado River Basin. As we've learned that there's a problem, we've established a program. So we learned that there was a lot of salinity in the water by the time it got to Mexico, so we created a salinity program to treat that water before it goes into Mexico. We learned that we were violating the Endangered Species Act in the lower basin and the upper basin, so they created a program to try to mitigate that. And so what I've been doing over the last number of years is doing interviews and attending meetings and trying to understand what's happening in these programs. And overall, we see much more participation of environmental interests, of tribal interests in these programs. Okay, this is the last section, and I'm going to turn to is all about modern governance. It's really setting the stage for what's been happening really over the last 2 decades or so. Well, I've said a couple of times now that the river has a hard time by the time it makes it into Mexico because you could imagine so many straws coming off the river. Restoration of the delta actually has been really powerful over the last 2 decades, really led by environmental NGOs that have played a big role, Environmental Defense, Audubon, Sonoran Institute, and many NGOs on the Mexican side of the border, really working to restore the delta, to bring water back to the delta and restore the ecosystem. In 2014, we did a pulse flow. You might have remembered that. National Geographic covered it. It was over many weeks, and what they did was release water from the dams to mimic how it naturally would have flowed, like the pulse, kind of like a pulse or a flood. And they traveled there were aerial photos and by foot and by boat, and everyone was pretty exciting, kind of traveling to see where the water went, to see the water go to the sea. And it was pretty we've learned a lot about the science from that. There was a lot of scientific studies, but also in terms of our imagination of what's possible, of how we could manage our systems in different ways. And the relationship between the United States and Mexico has really improved over the last decade, and that pulse flow was an example of that and an example of the heightened relationship. There's a whole legal process to amend that 1944 treaty with Mexico, and the US and Mexico has done that through a series of minutes, more than 300 of them over the last 80 years or so, and many of the most recent ones are all around efforts around restoration of the Delta. And a lot of that work, and as I said, it was led by NGOs, has really made the relationship between the US and Mexico better and has made Mexico a partner in shortage sharing with the US in times of drought like where we are now. And I understand from Bruce that the Lane Center did a workshop on the Delta once upon a time, and my colleague Chris Scott, who you're going to hear from in a little bit, has also done a lot of research around these efforts. By the early 2000s, so about 24 years ago now, the states and the Bureau of Reclamation started to say, we might be in trouble. These lake levels were dropping. The flows on the river, the snowpack wasn't looking like it did. The flows weren't looking like they thought it would. And the states and the Bureau of Reclamation said, we might need to think about shortage. If there's less water, what are we going to do? So they came up with the interim guidelines. It's not a very sexy title, but it was 2007. They're in place for 20 years, so they expire in 2026, which we're getting close to. And what they do is they set a series of tiers. When Lake Mead hits a certain level, then this is who's going to take cuts. And like I said, Arizona goes first, and so this is why we have a preoccupation with the levels at Lake Mead, because we're waiting to see. We're hoping we can keep enough water in the lake to not hit these levels and then trigger these cuts. Another thing that's happened along the way, 2017, the Water and Tribes Initiative. The Babbitt Center here at ASU has played a big role, a lot of private foundation money as well, trying to build capacity with the tribes, more sustainable solutions. And on the left there, you can see a map, and it shows where all of the reservation land is in the basin. I had said 30 federally recognized tribes in the basin, 22 in Arizona. So the majority are here. When the Water and Tribes Initiative talks with tribal members and leaders, what they hear over and over again is tribes want quantification of their rights, and they want to develop. They want to not just have paper water rights, like the rights on paper, but they actually want to be able to build and repair the infrastructure that they have. By 2019, the states and Bureau of Reclamation realized that the interim guidelines weren't enough. And so they went back to the table voluntarily. They added new tiers. The process looked a little different. The upper basin did their thing, the lower basin did their thing, and then they all came together. The goal, you could see at the bottom of this image, is to keep Lake Mead above 1,050 feet. So it was really how can we reduce more? How can we cut our use? I like this table. I didn't like it at first, but I've grown to like it. And why I like it, and this is how I would encourage you to look at it. On the far left, we're looking at Lake Mead elevation, but then it shows you the interim guidelines set some cuts. Some folks would use less water, and it shows you there, Arizona, Nevada. Then we did a minute with Mexico, and we added a little bit more cuts, like savings. This is our savings. Then we had DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan. Then we negotiated again with Mexico to reduce a little more. And so it kind of adds up. And all together, it kind of shows the savings, the water not used, reduced, that stays in the system. Last year, we were in 2A tier, but this year, because of conservation, we've been in tier 1. I made this image to kind of show a little bit of a path. Interim guidelines in 2007, when we're starting to realize, hey, there might not be as much water in this river as we thought. By 2019, it's like, what we did in 2007 isn't enough. We need to do more. We need further cuts. And then guess what? 2019, those cuts weren't enough. And so over the last year or two, pressured by the federal government, the states have said we need to do even more. And so we've been kind of operating under two processes over the last number of years. The first is that bigger circle, this draft EIS. It's the process now to make more cuts. And I know Sarah's going to talk more about this, but essentially this is the lower basin saying that they can conserve more water and leave water in the system. At the same time, we're figuring out what to do right now. They're starting the discussion about what are we going to do after 2026. So oftentimes the news is so confusing because we have two processes happening right now, like the short term and the long term. Thank goodness for federal funding. Federal funding has really saved us in many ways. The IRA, the infrastructure law, brought a lot of funding to the basin and to this region that has allowed farms to be fallowed, allowed cities to use less water. You can see Phoenix, Tucson has made some water reductions and taken federal funding to implement new conservation measures, to do other things with it. So the funding has really been key, especially for the lower basin, making the cuts that they need to make. Ultimately, things are fast moving in terms of governance and politics in this basin. What we've done since 1922 has been very fragmented and piecemeal. That little image in the middle, it's hard for you to see, but it's people. We've been bringing a lot more people to the table, but we still don't have very great formalized processes for how to do that. That's why it looks like pieces not quite put together. And we've really been operating with kind of a fire drill mentality. And so we need to kind of be thinking beyond this fire drill and beyond Band-Aid solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Whoa. And welcome to Tempe. Welcome to adjacent to ASU. I'm very happy to be with this fabulous panel to talk with you about the Colorado River. And I'm going to focus mostly on what are the impacts for Arizona, because J.B. Hamby is the expert on the impacts for California. A word a bit about where I come from. I am the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy, which is a think tank based at about a 44-year-old water policy think tank, Morrison Institute for Public Policy, that focuses on issues in Arizona and to some degree in the U.S. West. And I put this up at the front of my talk because I probably won't have time to finish. The Kyle Center has created a hub of information about Arizona water resources and policy called the Arizona Water Blueprint. You could Google it or you could copy down that website. If you get curious, you can go to the Arizona Water Blueprint and learn a lot more. This is what the landing page looks like, and you'll see that there's a whole section on Colorado River shortage, really mostly many tools and a long explainer about how shortage will impact Arizona. And you can also sign up for updates and be on our email list and learn more about what's going on with water policy from the work of the Kyle Center. So I want to step back and very briefly cover a few water basics before we proceed, because it is hard to talk about the Colorado River way out of context in terms of water resources in Arizona. So to start with, the Colorado River is not the only source of supply, thank goodness, for the state of Arizona. There are a total of 4 major sources of supply. In-state rivers, the main one being the Salt Verde system, which serves the greater Phoenix area. It's a big in-state river system. We have the Colorado River, of course. We have groundwater, water from the aquifers, and reclaimed water. A bigger and bigger part of the portfolio of the state of Arizona is the water that was in the wastewater treatment system, and then it was treated fit for another purpose. And this is how demand breaks in the state. As is the case in many other western states, the sector that uses the most water in the state of Arizona is agriculture. That has to do, I think, with 2 things. One is that we became, when Arizona became a state in terms of really when the The indigenous people were here. They were here for agriculture, not entirely, but a lot of people. And the first European American settlers who arrived saw that it was a good place for agriculture. There was water. It's very warm. We don't get that much rain. Those are really good conditions for growing food and fiber. And it takes a lot of water to grow stuff. And so as agriculture continues to be the major water user, that municipal pie there that you see is all the water that cities deliver to taps. So that can be and is to, for example, semiconductor fabrication plants, any business that's receiving its water supply from a municipal provider. Another important fact, and I'm not going to belabor this, but it could come up, is that in the most populous parts of the state, and particularly from Phoenix to Tucson, there is a high degree of regulation of groundwater in the state. So there's a push to try to not grow on groundwater and to manage groundwater, acknowledging that it's a non-renewable resource. And it's really the areas outside of the blobs that you see on the map where there is almost no regulation of groundwater. But I'm belaboring it partly to show you that we have these three areas: the Phoenix Active Management Area, the Pinal Active Management Area, and the Tucson Active Management Area, where there's this very high degree of groundwater regulation. And those happen to be the areas that are served by the Central Arizona Project, which Andrea mentioned before. Another important fact, just to get out of the way, is that reuse in the state of Arizona is very high. Very few places do as much reuse of the water formerly known as effluent as Arizona does. We use it to cool a nuclear power plant. It's used to recharge aquifers. It's used to water golf courses, to import tourism to the state, and it's used to restore riparian habitat. This is a photo in the lower right of the heritage of the Tucson Heritage Area, where a part of the Santa Cruz River is being restored with effluent, and that water eventually makes its way down into the aquifer, and Tucson gets credits, long-term storage credits. So now you know what AMAs are, and I can show you how demand breaks in Phoenix and Tucson, how supply breaks. You can see that Phoenix has the benefit of this big in-state surface water system, and this is how demand breaks. Not a big surprise, a lot of water in the Phoenix AMA is going to serve municipal demand, but still a big chunk of water is going to serve agricultural demand. These data come from the Department of Water Resources, our state water supply regulation agency, and they categorize all water use by tribes in the Phoenix AMA as tribal, so you see an 11% pie slice there. Most of that water is used for agriculture. And this is how the Tucson AMA supply breaks. Tucson does not have the benefit of a big in-state surface water system the way Phoenix has. And so Tucson is more reliant on Colorado River water as a percentage of supply as the city of Phoenix. Just some important background. Again, demand breaks very similarly in the Tucson area as in the Phoenix area. And we already heard about the Central Arizona Project, but we're talking about the Colorado River here, and I'm talking about Arizona, so I think this graphic will be helpful for reference. The Colorado River defines most of the state of Arizona's border with California, and we really have two big groups of users of Colorado River water in the state, and then a lot of subgroups within those two big groups. One group of users is users who draw their water directly from the main stem. And that would include the Colorado River Indian tribes, and you heard from one of their elected officials today about their use, and they're up near Lake Havasu, roughly. And then it also includes the farming area of Yuma, Arizona, down in the southwestern part of the state. That's a region that is responsible for producing almost all the lettuce that anyone in the United States eats from November through April. It's a big winter vegetable capital. So the main stem of the Colorado River, main stem users use about 1.2 million acre feet of water out of Arizona's 2.8 million acre feet apportionment of Colorado River water. roughly, in a non-shortage time, as much as 1.6 million acre-feet of water could be conveyed via the CAP for water users from, in the CAP service area, that three-county area. Now, in both of these, both along the main stem and within the CAP service area, we have this big variety of users. There are cities, most of the bigger cities are all in the CAP service area. We have tribal water rights holders, tribal users. We have irrigation districts. We have industry. We have little smaller water rights holders along the main stem, and then irrigation districts with substantial water rights holders, or tribes with relatively small rights and tribes with very substantial rights. So there's a great deal of variety in the size of the entitlement and in the type of user. And just to be clear about the junior priority that you heard about applies only to the CAP water users. It does not apply to users along the main stem. So it's not that Arizona has junior priority, it's that CAP water users are junior to other water users in the lower basin. So another little important point, and this is a graphic developed by the Department of Water Resources, is that population growth in central Arizona is not a driver of shortage on the Colorado River. This graphic is one way of describing this, but it is juxtaposing the economy as represented by the state gross income, and that's the vertical bars, with population growth, that's the line with the little human figure, half figure, and then water demand. And you can see that this is from 1957 to 2019. And as of around 1980, when Arizona imposed the Groundwater Management Act, that really imposed a lot of regulations on the use of water for growth, pushing growth to renewable supplies, creating a system for leaving water in the ground and still having credits to be able to use that water in the future or to recharge aquifers, really pushed people in the state, cities, water providers, farms, everyone toward greater efficiency. And so you see this remarkable result that the state has now almost 7 times the population, 21 times the economy, and yet we're using less water than we were using in the mid-1950s. Now, a lot of this is due to this policy that Arizona adopted when it enacted the Groundwater Management Act in 1980. By the way, it was kind of a moment in time that this act could be passed. Arizona had to do something about groundwater overdraft that was becoming a bigger and bigger problem in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as the cotton industry took off, largely due to the need for cotton in World War I and World War II, as people recognized that maybe Phoenix and Tucson would be nice places to live, and other industries came. Arizona was growing on groundwater, overdrafting an enormous amount of groundwater every year, and the Central Arizona Project was envisioned as the rescue plan, primarily for agriculture. It was brought in to save the region from groundwater overdraft by bringing in a renewable supply of water instead of the groundwater. So at around that time, when Arizona passed the Groundwater Management Act, it was recognized that growing cities in central Arizona on top of farms would lead to better water sustainability, for the reason that the water use per acre of cities is far lower than the water use per acre of farms. So we had a lot of policies in place that pushed urban development on top of farms. And this, of course, was, just to be clear, all voluntary. No farmer was forced to give up his or her land, but it increased the value of farms in central Arizona and really was the development strategy. Here's a not-so-fancy graphic that I created showing changes, water use by sector for a 20-year period in that CAP service area. And the yellow line that you see here is municipal demand. And for me as a water geek, why this is such an important visual is that that yellow line is barely increasing. It's in fact, it's going up 14%. Water demand in the municipal sector went up 14% in this 20-year period. The population growth in this same area was 45%. So to a great degree, urban growth, population growth has been decoupled from water demand, particularly as a result of various policies that are brought to bear in central Arizona. Again, underscoring that urban growth in Arizona is not a driver of shortage on what I'm going to talk about now, the Colorado River. You already have heard about how important this river is to the region. I won't belabor that. And you heard about the allocations that were eventually, it took decades to figure out how much certainly Arizona had a right to. It was a big tussle with our neighbor to the west. And so we're in this place where, as you heard from Andrea, we're seeing a substantial decline in storage in the two big reservoirs, I'll go back up, that hold water for the lower basin. That would be Lake Powell in the kind of north central Arizona, Glen Canyon Dam, you can see there, and Lake Mead, where Lake Hoover is near Las Vegas. Now, there are really three drivers of the declining lake levels in these two big reservoirs. One is most certainly climate change. We're seeing changes in the amount of snowpack, and maybe even more so, changes in how snowpack what happens with it in a hotter climate. Something like 80% of the flows in the Colorado River originate in the upper Rockies. This system was built for a certain kind of snowpack that would melt in a certain kind of way, and hotter temperatures, shorter winters are really disrupting how that system functions. So climate change is one driver. Another driver is the structural deficit. That is the issue that when water was allocated out of Lake Mead to the lower basin, there was no accounting for the evaporation off Lake Mead, for the normal losses that occur when you move water through a big system. A recent study by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation that manages this system concluded that the annual losses due to evaporation and system loss are somewhere around 1.3, maybe 1.4 million acre feet. When you think about the fact that the whole system between the two basins allocates out 15 million acre feet, a 1.4 million acre foot structural deficit is really, really a big problem. There's no discounting of anyone's deliveries to account for those losses for evaporation and system loss. And then the third driver is that many users, many entities with rights to use water from the Colorado system were not taking their water. So it's that's over allocation. They were leaving their water in the system because they didn't have a means of moving their water. You know, the Central Arizona Project didn't make its first delivery until 1985. So over time, the users, the people who have rights to water from the Colorado system have developed their use, and the over-allocation of the river has become very daylighted as a result. So we have a series of agreements. We just heard quite a bit about them, and we can just think of them as, you know, I don't think we need to think about the individual agreements. I loved the explanation of them as kind of an evolution over time. And I look at them as adaptations. It's very hard when you think about it. We're talking about 7 states, 29 sovereign tribes, 5 million acres of agriculture, major cities, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, Denver, San Diego, you know, others. They all rely on water from this system. And the preference, as evidenced by the approach that we've taken to dealing with shortage on the Colorado River, is adaptation. Let's be adaptive. Let's put some measures in place, see if it's sufficient, and if it isn't, we'll go figure out something else. And that has been an ongoing way of addressing it. I would even take issue with the Band-Aid and the fire drill, because it really has been an enormous amount of work taking up a whole lot of people's lives to try to adapt and see what happens. And we can't predict. We can't predict what will happen in the next 4 or 5 years we can predict that we'll probably have continued climate change impacts, but we're really taking a guess as to how much water will be flowing in the river. So Central Arizona has taken the lion's share of the shortage, as stated before, and there are additional proposals on the table from the lower basin, from the upper basin. There's it's not exactly a formal proposal, but it's a set of conditions that were voiced by a group of tribes. We're expecting other proposals to kind of be put forth. And in a nutshell, we're going to have a tussle for about the next year to come to an agreement on additional measures to take to try to get us out of the danger zone of the reservoir levels continuing to decline. And what I think is important for you to understand about this tussle isn't all the details of how much a cut this or that entity is taking, but instead imagine having to get consensus, not just of the 7 states and Mexico. You have to get the 7 states and Mexico with all their different needs to agree, but you also have to get the water users, the Colorado River rights holders within the state to agree, more or less, to what you're doing. And so I really feel for our negotiators, because it's their job to sell the agreement to all of the stakeholders, and this is no easy task. Arizona has, I just wanted to highlight that since 2014 or so, Arizona has conserved over 3.5 million acre-feet of water. This is almost all CAP water. Some of it is from the Colorado River Indian tribes, would be voluntary conservation from main stem water. But for the most part, Arizonans, with all this conservation, Arizonans have not felt the impact. And much of that is due, there are many different reasons, but much of it is due to long-term planning requirements about water that would spare urban residents from feeling the impacts of shortage. I think we already talked about this. This is the schedule for coming up with this new big agreement this process is called the reconsultation. Everything in the Colorado River has some weird arcane name, and so the process that we're talking about to come up with new guidelines for operating the system is the reconsultation, and the parties are putting out their proposals, and there's going to be a lot of wrangling with the hope that they can come to an agreement sometime in 2025, sufficient for the Bureau of Reclamation to be able to do the necessary environmental impact analysis that could get us over the finish line. In the state of Arizona, we require legislative approval for changes in the Colorado Compact, so that we need to have legislation in our state. Usually we need federal approval for changes. I'm just about out of time, or maybe truly out of time, but I will. I want to underscore that in the Colorado, one of the big difficulties that we have dealing with, struggling with this problem, is that agriculture is the largest user of water in the lower Colorado, and this is really true in the entire Colorado Basin. And agricultural users tend to have, not always, but for the most part, have the highest priority rights, meaning that they are not the first in line for cuts. True for their variety of priorities for tribes, depending on whether they have a decreed right or a settled right, but in a very simplistic way of looking at this, water needs to come from agriculture in order to save these rivers, but we're talking about the entities with very senior rights, and we're also talking about very direct impacts when their water supply is cut. It means less water for an input, less water to go grow crops, economic impacts on people's livelihoods, on whole communities. So it's a very, very difficult problem to solve. I think that was my main hope. I still have more slides. I'm out of time, but mainly I wanted to underscore for you all that from my perspective, work on achieving consensus to new operating guidelines has been ongoing. There are dozens of people in every state who do this as their full-time job. Very often when we look at it from the outside, it looks goofy. But once we drill down and think about how important that water supply is for each and every user, how important it is to achieve consensus on changes in how the system is operated, then we can understand why it's so very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time here today. I have to preface by saying this is very history-focused. I am myself a Stanford history alum, and in fact, I took Mr. Kane's American West course when I was a freshman at Stanford less than 10 years ago. So I will kick off by giving an overview from California's perspective of the development of the Colorado River from its origins to today and where we're going into the future. So a little bit about how we do Colorado River here in California, is in 1937, the Colorado River Board of California was formed to be able to serve the collective interest of all of our individual rights holders within the state and contractors. Different than how some of the other states in the basin do it. You have governor's appointees who directly do the negotiations in that front. What we decided to do in California is we were not so keen on Sacramento sort of dictating how Colorado River negotiations were done. So the Colorado River Board was formed initially between the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the San Diego County Water Authority, Imperial Irrigation District, Coachella Valley Water District, and Palo Verde Irrigation District. Later, we had 2 state members and 2 public members also added from Department of Water Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and then as well our public members, which have just been filled within the last couple of years here. Frank Ruiz from the Audubon Society, for an NGO who focuses on salt and sea issues, as well as Fort Yuma Kutzon Indian Tribe Tribal President Jordan Joaquin. So a little bit about the basin states process. Each of the states has an appointed representative that goes back to how things were done when the Colorado River Compact was initially negotiated throughout and leading up to 1922. So that process remains the same to this day, in large part. And in California, the way we do that is the Colorado River Board appoints a chair, elects a chair, and serves as the state's commissioner. So the basin states representatives meet sometimes more often than not. Up to this point, within the past number of months, it's been very active, and then when we hit a bit of a snag, it gets to be a little less active. And I'll go through, and as some of our colleagues here have described some of those issues that have been negotiated in the past. A little bit about our water rights users and holders in California, starting with first in terms of our priorities for contractors is the Palo Verde Irrigation District, 100% dependent on the Colorado River. The community of Blythe is right there. Vice Chair Dwight is neighbor on the other side of the river, as you can see right there, and serves about 105,000 acres of forage, vegetables, and fruit crops. Oldest filing on the Colorado River, priority date 1877. And in the southeast, very southeastern corner of California, we have the Fort Yuma Kutzon Indian Tribe and the Barred Water District. You have the reservation, then within that is the Barred Water District, within that is the individual irrigated acreage of the tribe. It's about half and half of that 15,000 acres that's irrigated as part of the Yuma project, larger Yuma project in Arizona, but also spills over into California as well. And then we have the Imperial Irrigation District, this green oven mitt in the desert that uses some water but also conserves quite a bit as well, generating 500,000 acre-feet a year of water conservation to help keep California within its entitlement on the river. And then we have our friends to the north, the Coachella Valley Water District, 330,000 acre-foot right to Colorado River water, plus some additional transferred water, bell peppers, dates, all kinds of fun stuff you'll find up there. And then this small water agency here on the coast that has an aqueduct that flows from Parker area all the way to Southern California, the Metropolitan Water District, serving 26 member agencies, 19 million people of the 40 million folks that we hear often referenced who live within or depend upon Colorado River water. Half of those people live in California. Most all of those live within metropolitan. And a little bit about the story and the origins of how we operate the Colorado River today really have their origins in California. Even, I'm going to start here a little bit later in time, but really dates back to the gold rush and the prior appropriation system. The priority system as we know it today really has its origins out of that. So leading up to 1922, there was big development of Colorado River water, particularly in the Imperial Valley. You had this large desert area that was below sea level, and you had the Colorado River, which was upstream, and some far-sighted people saw the idea, well, there's all this silt. The Colorado River used to overflow its banks, filled up all this silt, and this would be a great place to farm if we just had a canal. So they did that, and they developed what became ultimately 500,000 acres of irrigated acreage and used some water in doing so. In urban Southern California, when all the local supplies had sort of run out and the Owens Valley, the aqueduct there was simply not enough, Los Angeles was looking to some additional supply, and they saw the Colorado River as the best place to do it. LA DWP not being big enough, particularly leading up to in this Depression era, big enough to do it itself. That's how Metropolitan ultimately was formed, with the goal of getting additional supplies from the Colorado River. That all being said, lots of people moving into California, lots of land being brought into acreage. That was concerning to some folks, largely in the upper basin, where most of the precipitation occurs, but all of this population and development of water was taking place downstream. So the essential compromise that ended up needing to be reached was through the Colorado River Compact. California was looking to develop additional supply, but needed some infrastructure in order to do that. Needed a large dam on the lower Colorado River because the Imperial Valley kept getting washed out by these massive, devastating floods, particularly from 1905 to 07. And then another interesting factor was that the water had to get to the Imperial Valley through Mexico and then come back through Mexico up into the Imperial Valley because there was a large set of sand dunes that precluded the ability to take it through the United States. Complicating things was a revolution in Mexico at the time, which was concerning for folks about water security for sure. So the compact that was ultimately hammered out was not individually dividing up who gets what between the individual states or users, but between the basins. And this was the ultimate compromise. California principally wanted to see additional development, secure those big projects. In order to do so, they needed to get the upper basin states to sign off, but the upper basin states, concerned all this growth and development going on in the lower basin, principally California, would any water be left at that point for use in these upper basin states under this doctrine of prior appropriation between the states? So after the compact was signed by 6 out of the 7 states at the time, Arizona was a notable exception at that particular period, the Boulder Canyon Project Act was authorized, passed by the Congress, which authorized the Hoover Dam, Imperial Dam, All-American Canal, all of this pertinent infrastructure, paid for by California power sales, interestingly enough. And the Boulder Canyon Project Act noted California would be given 4.4 million acre feet plus additional surplus. The contracting responsibility went to the Interior Secretary, and then contracts were given to the individual users in California. But importantly, another bit of compromise that was required here, in order to get this through, the upper basin had a catch. They said, we want to see you, California, limit your rights to 4.4 million acre feet a year. And so ultimately, California said, we really want Hoover Dam, what would become Hoover Dam, very badly. We really want the All-American Canal. We're willing to do that. And then in 1929, our legislature approved this act limiting our rights to 4.4 million acre feet. So this is how we ultimately split it up. But if you note, we didn't exactly count up to just 4.4. We also tacked on some additional contracts through the Interior Secretary for 5.362 million acre feet, which you'll note is a larger number than 4.4. We'll get to that in a moment because it gets complicated. So as I mentioned, Arizona had some issues during the compact, ultimately did not sign on to that, and then had some issues with California as well, over at least 3 Supreme Court cases here, and then another notable fun story you can look up yourself about the Arizona Navy and LADWP having to save a shipwrecked group of Arizona Navy men. And so in 1952, we were ultimately coming to a head in differences of points of view between Arizona and California about who actually gets what There are fundamentally different understandings between the two states about how we split up the 7.5 million acre feet a year for our uses in the lower basin. There had been several attempts at getting a subcompact together, so a compact between the 3 lower basin states on how we would do that. Lots of fits and starts. Ultimately, it was never agreed to. So finally, things come to a head. There's fundamental differences. CAP was a big project. Various Arizonans at the time really wanted to see water developed, taken from the Colorado River, moved up here into the central part of the state. California objected to that, being concerned that that was going to deplete available supply in California and all of these existing users for either the very senior water rights or the millions of people that had settled in Southern California. So Arizona filed suit looking to deal with this issue, triggered by California repeatedly blocking the CAP in Congress. Our delegation was large at the time. Now it's sort of starting to shrink. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, after a number of years in what became the longest case in the history of the United States Supreme Court, which ended up only getting the books closed on it in 2006. The Supreme Court settled this dispute largely over what is the Gila River, is this part of the Colorado River or not, and whether the prior appropriation doctrine applied overall or whether the particular elements of this Boulder Canyon Project Act did. Ultimately, California was very surprised to have lost on both, but that cleared a key legal hurdle for CAP to move forward. Importantly, though, as part of this case, which went on for a number of years, even after this initial 10 years or so period, it identified specific volumes and acreages for tribal and other present perfected right holders. Those are the rights that existed prior to the compact being in effect. So a lot of conflict leading up to that point. Folks decided this is not the best approach moving forward. And so another compromise was struck in the authorization of the Central Arizona Project, in which the CAP was authorized, but on the other hand, another catch, which was a California concern. If there is to be a shortage on the future, we want to make sure our users are protected. If there's going to be new uses, those ones should feel the brunt. That was the compromise reached at the time, and ultimately that was what was agreed to in the authorizing legislation for the CAP, and the Interior Secretary was directed to, seeing that there was going to be a shortfall of probably in excess of 2 million acre feet, start planning augmentation, and we're still waiting on that plan. In 1970, as a result of the 68 Act, some of these questions which are pertinent to today, the Interior Secretary was also directed to develop criteria on how the river should be managed moving forward, which established this 8.23 million acre feet minimum release from Lake Powell. Important number to both Arizona and California nowadays. Our fundamental understanding of that number is the lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet a year, plus the upper basin is to deliver half of the Mexican treaty. The upper basin has a general view that that is sort of a number picked out of a hat. So CAP was built. CAP starts pulling water off the Colorado River. Getting back to that number that was larger than 4.4 million acre feet a year, California had been depending on 5.3 million acre feet or up to for a very long time. Millions of people within Southern California were depending upon those supplies. Now that surplus water was no longer available. So a former Arizona governor became Interior Secretary and told California, you need to get back within your 4.4 million acre foot entitlement. Big problem. That's a large number to take a 800,000 acre foot diet, particularly when that was going to be felt by the urban folks within Southern California. Ultimately, what took a lot of wrangling, years to be able to negotiate, and about a decade to validate in the courts, was the quantification settlement agreement, which turned 20 years old this past fall. Key provisions here is that it quantified those formerly unquantified agricultural users in California, and then provided for a suite of transfers, largely from the Imperial Irrigation District and Palo Verde Irrigation District, to other urban users within Southern California, and then also lined the All-American Canal, which, when it was built, went across some sand dunes, which were a little leaky. And the state of California, importantly though, as part of all of this water being generated by conservation in the Imperial Valley, that meant less water was going into the Salton Sea. So big sticking point throughout these negotiations, and the state ultimately assumed the restoration obligations. Importantly, these conservation efforts and these partnerships continue today. IID has generated in excess of 7.2 million acre feet in the last 20 years that's been available for other uses in California to keep California's collective uses within its legal rights. And Metropolitan, who was seeing at that time when we had to shrink back within our 4.4 million acre foot entitlement, half of the Colorado River aqueduct supply is being completely wiped out, was able to build partnerships with tribal and agricultural partners within Southern California to be able to refill the aqueduct and to continue serving this vital supply to Southern California. As has been talked about, we've taken over the last 20 or so years a very collaborative approach to how we manage the Colorado River. This really began in 2001 with the development of guidelines to divvy up all the surplus. If you see in that picture there, that's a very full Lake Mead. Doesn't look like that today. But that was the first sort of test at being able to come together and develop a collaborative set of rules and then handing those over to the secretary and say, we really like this to be the approach moving forward rather than litigating out various issues. That was 2001. Very shortly thereafter, after all the surplus had been divided up, shortage was happening. And so the states were called together by Interior Secretary Gil Norton at the time and said, come up with a plan. If we need to make reductions, I'd rather you figure it out rather than me and have the uncertainty of either the secretary or the courts sorting that out. So that essentially came up with this shortage strategy within the lower basin, and then this nifty idea of being able to store water in a declining reservoir, which made sense. And California developed over 2 million acre feet of storage within the lake. That, of course, not being enough, a Band-Aid, another layer there, or what was referred to as an overlay, was the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan, which was those guidelines from 2007 that were supposed to be in place for over 20 years were simply not enough. And the states needed to be called back together and come up with some additional volumes of water, at which point California contributed as well to be able to make sure that we were protected from critical elevations. Everything solved? Not really, because in the summer of 2022, Reclamation Commissioner came out and said 2007 guidelines, 2019 DCP, all those plans, layer upon layer, simply not enough. So she called for, in Senate testimony, 2 to 4 million acre feet a year of potential reductions and a plan within 60 days. Stretch goal, and ultimately the states were not able to materialize that plan in that period of time. Fortunately, and big kudos to outgoing Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who made really all of this happen, quite frankly. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act included $4 billion for Western drought. And that was able to, which I'll touch on in a moment here, materialize large-scale conservation to be able to protect the system. As part of that, California offered up 400,000 acre feet a year for the duration of the rest of the guidelines to be able to protect the system in hopes that that would motivate additional efforts from other states. And at the same time, this funding also made available significant $250 million of funding for the Salton Sea, which materialized needed agricultural efforts within California. So there was California, that was one. There were 6 other states that were still not on board. And so the Interior Department came forward, reopened the 07 guidelines and say, we need a process to start to open this up. In January of last year, very challenging time. We had 6 other basin states versus California, dueling proposals. Not a great place to be, but fortunately throughout the spring, Arizona, California, and Nevada were able to come together and develop a plan to protect the Colorado River system from then until the end of the current guidelines, ensuring that we were not reaching those critical elevations where you physically couldn't pass water through Glen Canyon or Hoover Dam down to folks in the lower basin. So we developed a plan, which we call the Lower Basin Plan, fittingly, to generate 3 million acre feet of conservation by 2026, the end of the current guidelines. That is more conservation that's ever been generated by any prior agreement ever before, both funded and unfunded. So this is going to protect critical elevations through this period of time, and Reclamation just recently adopted this as their preferred alternative to be able to protect the system in the near term. I think dumpster fire was mentioned earlier. This media celebrated this. They thought this was good. We did too. But now we move on to 2026 and beyond. So that was the past. We've got to the dealing with these current present issues, putting these near-term fires out. but we have to develop a new set of rules to operate the Colorado River for the next 20 years and beyond. One thing to start off with is that the Interior Department has established a very effective federal tribal state process for post-2026, where all 30 tribal nations throughout the Colorado River Basin, 7 basin states representatives, and Interior and Reclamation all sit down around either a very large table or on a Zoom call and go through these issues. And big news is sometimes announced to us for the first time there. And that's been very helpful to initiate and formalize dialogue that really hadn't occurred anything like this before. We in the lower basin, after working feverishly with our counterparts in the upper basin and continued dialogue with our partners, tribal partners throughout the basin, were unable at this current point in time, still story developing here, to develop a consensus approach for what we think the next 20 plus years should look like on the Colorado River. So as was mentioned previously, the lower basin states submitted our alternative of what we think should be considered and modeled and analyzed. The 4 upper basin states submitted theirs, and there's other ones emerging. But to sort of walk through the main parameters of what we're thinking makes sense move forward is, as has been mentioned before, there's a structural deficit. It's a large number. And our idea is we need to tackle that for good, and actually we've come to the idea of acknowledging this is a thing that should be done, which is a big enough goal as it is, but now agreeing to a set of principles about how we're going to split this massive number up. But not only that, how do we start to rebuild storage so that we're not minutes away or years, few short months or years away from hitting critical elevations? So we've developed a plan to cover that. Also start to respond to climate change. What if cutting, in our plan to resolve the structural deficit, 1.5 million acre feet a year? For context, that's as much water as Mexico uses in any given year. Big number. But what if that's not enough? So our point of view is anything in excess of that number, that should be a shared obligation between all who benefit on the Colorado River. Our partners in the upper basin feel that that should fall exclusively upon Arizona, California, Nevada. We disagree with that. And then also managing the system as a whole. That's what this thing in the upper left-hand side here is. Rather than just looking at Lakes Powell and Meade, which there's been a lot of either real or perceived issues of gaming the system just on those 2 reservoirs, taking a look at the system as a whole. And then also starting to come up with some easier and better rules for how we store water in these very empty reservoirs. This has been covered, still a work in process. We look forward to trying to have something hammered out by the end of the year. Sometimes easier said than done. And I see a red 0 back there, and I will cut it there. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes for questions. So the floor now is on the audience. Do you have any question? Please go ahead.
So tax.
Is there a mic?
Okay, yeah. Thanks very much. That was very educational for me. I loved it. I have one very simple question, or actually 2 related questions. The simple question is this. There's 1.2 million acre feet of water evaporated by those lakes annually. Would you? One of those.
To 1.4 off of Meade.
Right, yeah. So more, right? Would you evaporate that water in the farmers' fields or on the lake? What's your thought on that? And the related question is, as a hydrologist, I always found it, hydroclimatologist, I found it always amusing that people use the average for doing these allocations, because what % of time do you really have it? And so do you think there's an opportunity to think a bit differently, because the last figure you put up is starting to go in that direction?
Do you want to answer that?
Different ideas exist. I'm not sure this is on. Different ideas exist out there about how you exactly quantify what the structural deficit is, at least from our understanding in California. You've got the net gains and losses, so you have all this evaporation. There's seepage too, and there's phreatophytes, fun word for weeds that grow along the river and evaporate water off. But then there's also gains, which are pretty significant in the lower basin. There's side flows that enter into the system. But then on top of that, another old question is how do we come up for our half of the Mexican treaty obligation? So you add all those things together, net it out, and it's a net negative that, at least in our calculation, is somewhere around 1.2. But certainly, a lot of this is based on whatever inputs you're using, which could be hydrologic, they could be legal too. Those are all essential questions. I think the main point is, moving forward, there's going to be declining flows on the river. We're seeing new concerning trends. Even when we have average years of snowpack, the runoff is reduced. Those soils get baked dry in the upper basin and the headwaters of the Colorado River in the summertime. And then when that snow does melt, even when it's an average amount of snow we're getting, which is good, that water doesn't make its way into the rivers and streams. So I think the main idea is that we need to be able to plan based on our best available knowledge moving forward. At least our plan within the Lower Basin Plan looks at the actuals of what's in the reservoirs as a whole, not just two of them, and also getting away from, I should say, what's been the current practice of making projections and predicting what the future might be in a year or two, and then basing our operations off of that. Throwing that aside and say, how much is in the system as a whole, what's the health, and then we respond accordingly.
I think the lower basin proposal that's looking at the whole system and then responding based on the storage in the entire system is truly a game changer in terms of the approach to managing the system. It's really create a different way of looking at it. I do want to respond to the comment about allocations, and that is, it's very easy for us to look at this and look back and say how silly of them. Back in 1922, when the basins were divided, really only California was using serious amounts of that water. To the people at the Colorado Compact, it seemed like this is a river that produces enormous amount of water, and we need to come up with some ways of sort of holding California back. That was really the concern of 6 of the negotiators there. How do we rein California in? And they weren't thinking, what might happen 100 years from now when every single entity that has an entitlement to use water from this river actually takes their water out? So it wasn't a thoughtful allocation based on an average. Even at the time, there's a great book called Science Be Damned by Eric Kuhn and John Fleck, which is about even the willingness of the negotiators to deliberately ignore data, hydrologic data that they had, that the river actually didn't produce as much as they thought. They thought the river produced 16, 17 million acre feet. They simply didn't have that problem in front of them. What do we do if every drop is allocated? The problem in front of them was, how do we come up with some kind of framework that will do something about our fear that California someday could have rights to almost all the water in the Colorado River?
Let's open it up, have more questions.
If it, at the end of the day, came down to a choice between dividing the Colorado River by population or by contribution to the GDP, what would you choose?
I think population and GDP are largely synonymous. There's a lot of these sort of ways of thinking, a lot of discussions, particularly newspaper articles, about what we're doing is reallocating the Colorado River and the rest of it. We're not. We have this body of compacts, contracts, laws, and everything else that form the law of the river. This is what we have. If you read any of these letters that have either 7 or 4 or 3 flags on top of them, they always say in one of the paragraphs toward the top is, we want to develop rules that respect and honor and protect the law of the river. And then at the final page of the whole letter is always, we reserve our rights to blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So everyone has totally competing, wildly divergent views of what the law of the river is, except on the idea that we all want to preserve it. I think the main idea is that moving forward, this is what we have. We need to be able to continue to adapt to honor and respect the spirit of what these things are, but also to respond to new trends like climate change. So I think getting to your point about population or GDP, if I could make a plug about sort of where we are, at an editorial comment, I should say, about where we are in these basin state negotiations, we presently are in a situation where the upper basin has said that they would only consider making any reductions if the lower basin was to get our uses down to what theirs are. That amounts to a reduction of 3 million acre feet. That's the entire contents of what Arizona and Nevada use a year, 2 Mexicos, or 3 metropolitans. So not exactly the most pragmatic approach, particularly when you look at the basin as a whole. Those 3 lower basin states have the bulk of the economic productivity within the basin, both agricultural and urban, and the population too. 3/4 of the population was within our lower basin states. So I think ultimately we want to be able to balance in an appropriate way the different needs that exist, protecting and preserving the rules as we all see fit, but also adapting to new and changing circumstances. And the idea is to get to an agreement. That's something that everyone can agree to, so that's going to involve some level of balance.
Just to play devil's advocate, because we are really heavily biased here for our representation on the lower basin, I think the upper basin would argue that they could too have economic growth and development and population growth if they had a fair share of the water. So I think, it's what comes first, the people or the water, and what those connections are.
But the issue of water or people versus GDP it's missing some important inputs. And one is that we don't want to allocate water that way because food would be incredibly expensive if we did. It was our nation's policy for decades and decades and decades, well into the 20th century, from the Newlands Act until the CAP was built, to really make sure that we were, and we can take issue with this policy, but essentially the policy was to move large amounts of water to where someone could grow food, because the nation was worried about food security, was worried about food affordability. Food affordability has been by some interpretations, a great success. Until very recently, the average household was spending something like 10% to 15% of disposable income on food, down from something like 50% in the 40s. When we think about what we do with water, we need to preference semiconductor fabrication over food production. It can have ramifications for society that we might not like. So I don't think it's a question that I would ever want to have to answer.
Thanks. Each of you spoke about the history and the background of both the compact, but the interstate derangements and leading up to the situation where we are today. So on the premise that we should learn from history so we aren't doomed to repeat it, can you help us think, maybe not the question of the gentleman in the back, although something similar, what would be future new types of arrangements and agreements that would forestall or even do away with the permanent state of crisis that we're in? I do actually think the alarm bell is constantly sounding, and I think we are in a perpetual state of crisis. So do we have plans that get us beyond a state of crisis, or do we have planning for 10 and 20 years that lets us just keep up with the alarm bell?
So I'll jump in first. I think that there has been some amount of can kicking historically. I've found little pamphlets and stuff from the 1940s when California was concerned about what they called overdraft before it later became known as structural deficit. You look at those numbers, and what they were concerned about was when the upper basin used their full amount. That never actually happened. What happened instead was climate change. The results were the same. There was a math problem, and it was never resolved. But there was enough water in the reservoirs where we didn't have to confront these issues until we had some of these agreements on top of each other, until we're finally getting to a breaking point because the system is drawn down to its most critical levels. So I think learning from that, it doesn't make sense to continue to do the overlay on top of overlay. We have to just wrap our hands around the issue and deal with it. So number one is addressing the structural deficit permanently, but also trying to think proactively about climate change and what happens if that's not enough. But ultimately, the only way we get there is for everyone to collectively agree to do their part. Otherwise, it's an important thing that we all should do, but we don't have any takers to actually do it.
You know, crisis isn't always a bad thing, right? What is that saying? Never waste a good crisis. I teach environmental policy, and the whole history of environmental policy in the U.S. is from crisis, right? Rivers on fire, birds dying from DDT, oil contamination on our beaches, and so, a lot of good can come from that. I don't think we've really seen it yet. Someone mentioned, JB, or someone said, we still protect the law of the river. I've been studying the Colorado River for almost 3 decades now, and when I started, no one wanted to talk about any changes to the law, to the compact and what that meant, and no one wanted to talk about examples from other parts of the world where we can learn how to do governance differently, where they have more modern institutions compared to the ones that we created in this space. And I think over the last, 4, 5, 6 years, I've really seen that change. I've seen people now talking and writing and thinking about what would happen if we didn't have the compact, or could we change it? And I hear people now asking, how do they do things in other places? And one of the big challenges is we don't know how to engage tribes formally. We do it piecemeal, ad hoc, not well, and not regularly, and not consistently, and they're always at the door knocking to be at the table, and we don't have a formal mechanism. So at a minimum, we need to be thinking creatively, and we need to think about what that structure looks like. It can't just be Bureau of Reclamation having conversations with the state negotiators, and then the Secretary of the Interior occasionally calling a meeting. There needs to be something baked in the system that gives that structure. At a minimum, that's a change we need. So and the NEPA process, the EIS process, isn't also a great process for this. I mean, it's a way to engage the public, but people writing letters, there's 20,000 comments on this. I mean, it just isn't the way to have dialogue and conversation, so a really formal kind of legal process like that. So we really need to think more creatively about how people can sit down and work together.
I think there are changes. The drought contingency plan the guidelines of 2007, the drought contingency plan of 2019, this game-changing way of looking at the whole system and taking reductions based on total storage in the system. These are changes to the Colorado Compact, and it is. I just listened to the latest Arizona stakeholder meeting about the lower basin proposal. It was the effort by the Arizona negotiators to basically sell it to the stakeholders, and there were 2 good questions which prompted the response, we're reserving our rights. Because people in Arizona are seeing, one of the arguments over the Colorado Compact is the lower basin believes that the upper basin is required to deliver 75 million acre feet of water every 10 years, as that amount over every 10-year period. And the upper basin is saying, we're not required, that you're reading the compact wrong. And the proposal that JB showed you would allow for 6 million acre feet to be delivered multiple years, year after year, if the storage in the whole system reached a certain low point. And the question was, are we giving up on the 75 million acre foot obligation? That was one of the questions of one of the stakeholders. And the Director of Water Resources said, we're reserving our rights. So I think that's how we get there. That's a huge change to say we'll live with 6 million acre feet a year for years, for a string of years, is a huge change. Oh.
I guess it's me. All right, thank you so much. So I wanted to, there was some mention about dams on the Colorado River and all the other rivers alongside as well. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about silting up of those dams. I know that's a big problem with them. It's something that restricts the flow and can ultimately, affect the deficit and everything. So I wanted to see if there's some discussion about progress we've made in reducing the silt in those dams and how that will affect the structural deficit over time.
So I could reference something. So there's a guy named Northcutt Ely who argued Arizona versus California for California, and he wrote a little paper in something called the Fortnightly Club, which references this whole issue. The main point of it, though, is that we often talk about doing stuff for our kids and our children's, whatever. That particular siltation of, all these dams, that's like great-grandchildren question, and I don't think anyone's spent time figuring that one out, so.
Like here.
I'm a little confused about the distinction between productivity and population. In California, agriculture generates about $50 billion a year. That's 2.5% of the California economy. So if you don't privilege agriculture, then I just don't understand if you're doing it by population and productivity, it's over.
Well, in Arizona, agriculture is similar, maybe 2 to 4%. Semiconductor fabrication far outstrips agriculture. I think my point is that if we were only looking at, okay, good. I mean, almost anything, tourism exceeds agriculture. Golf parallels agriculture in Arizona.
Well, since I have the mic, I'll go next. I turned it on, Brady. It works better. No. So look, this is a Californian who's going to say some things critical of California. So largely because I don't know enough about Arizona to be critical. So don't take it as a friendly act necessarily. Look, the honest answer is it's not all about food in the agricultural sector. Come on. You know that we've got crops that shouldn't really be grown in our area. No, I'm not talking about Arizona, but I'm talking to JB. You know.
And Dwight, too, over there.
Yeah. You know that we're growing cotton in certain places. You know we're growing alfalfa in certain places. You know, the reality is, as David points out, it's only 2% of GDP in California. And a lot of these crops could be grown elsewhere. The real problem is the system of rights that we have that was useful in the 19th century for the purposes of irrigation, as was pointed out, and now we have to really rethink all of that. So to me, there's a deeper discussion that needs to be had about exactly how, given the nature of our economies in the lower basin and the growth of the urban areas and the fact that in many ways you get more efficiencies by letting more people live here than alfalfa being grown for the animals and could be done elsewhere, we really ought to be rethinking what is the appropriate side of agriculture. Now, it can't be done in your negotiations. It has to be done at the state level. But that really, the whole question of vegetation as a part of water conservation is not just a problem in your area down here. It's a problem all up and down the coast of California, where we have lots of areas where we're drawing the groundwater for crops that could be grown elsewhere. So, I mean, do you disagree? Anybody disagree about that?
So I guess interactive audience question, keep your hand up if this applies to you. How many people for lunch that we just had outside, the strip loin steak or the steak out there? Put your hand up. Dwight did, okay. Who had the feta on your salad? Anyone have the feta on their salad? Who had the tropical cake out there for dessert? Keep your hands up if you've said yes to any of those questions. Okay, so all of you have indirectly consumed Colorado River water through alfalfa that either produced the beef that we had as one of the two entrees, or milk, or another milk product as part of the other item. So certainly we grow these things here in the United States, whether it's Dwight and the Colorado River Indian tribes, or in imperial or in high elevation communities in the upper basin, because there's a need, because folks make those choices when they go to the grocery store or have nice events like this and want to feed people a good meal. So certainly I think as we move forward, those consumer choices will continue and remain, and farmers will continue to get more efficient and learn to live with less and adapt to these changing circumstances. So balancing act, certainly an easy thing to find a convenient villain, but I think the villain sometimes, if we're looking for one, is ourselves and our own choices.
I want to throw in, I know we're out of time, but I appreciate your identifying the rights system rather than the food grown, because the farmers they're using their inputs to grow what there's a market for, as you just said, and there's a huge market for alfalfa because of what people love to eat. If you're saying we should let farmers use less water, we need to change the water that they have so that they use less, then I think we have to think about what are the impacts? What are the impacts on their economies? what, this is, we have to think as a region and as a nation how we mitigate those impacts.
Yeah, and with that, it's time for the break, and I am sure some of these conversations can take place over coffee. Thank you.